Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 8, Fire in the Marsh. The tall trees and thickets of the dank wood finally thinned out and retreated from the road after 3 days of travel. In a narrow place, Vran passed through an abandoned gateway where the line stretched away its wicked barbs and traps to east and west. The old threat of the hunting trails no longer made them tremble. Nothing remained but the terrible memories. Lund felt a mounting anticipation, almost a choking apprehension, as the woodland receded. They were stepping out into the outside world, with no experience of it and so little knowledge. What would they discover? Was the information given by the maimed beaters reliable? He reached behind his neck to touch the hilt of his blade. The instincts of the runner returned to him, a heightened awareness, as he scanned the way ahead of them. It was time for a scout to return with news. They were passing through the lands of their mortal enemy, and he imagined hostile eyes peering from the shadows, the quick whispers, the straining of a bowstring. He turned to the boy next to him.
Brennick, run ahead and find our scout. Don't go too far. If you don't see him after half a mile, turn back.
The blond head nodded quickly, and Brennick set off at a trot. Lund watched the blade on his back swinging this way and that, though the boy tightened his grip on it. The strip of grayish cloth was wound round his upper left arm where the arrow had pierced it in the Ronin cave. On his hurrying feet were the leather sandals of a beater. He had cut them down in size and had been absurdly proud to put them on. He had found a sleeveless tunic to wear over the breechclout that had been his only garment since the royal hunt. How far he had come since then, how far they all had, how many dangers they had faced and triumphed. Brithael's voice broke through his reverie.
"He's a warrior, that one, much like you."
Lund smiled at him.
And you are not?
Brith considered this for a few moments.
"I have slain the enemy. That would make me one, I suppose. But I do not have the blind courage of that boy. He puts me to shame."
It's not courage he has, it's devotion. That's what makes him forget his fear and risk all. I have learned that much from him. Anger and hate will drive you to action and overcome your fear, but devotion will make you sacrifice all you have. That is what protected me from the Grey Ones in the arena that time. Hate could not keep me. It was you, and Cerwin, and Brennick, all the helpless Vron that I would aid in any way I can. That was my shield, and it still is.
Since it was nearly noon, Lund gave instructions to halt for a period of rest and a meal. There were many little legs that struggled to keep up even with the slower pace of the carts. It would be disastrous when they were completely worn out to be discovered and attacked. Brennick and the tardy scout appeared on the road soon enough. There was nothing to report, as before, apart from a significant change in the landscape. The scouts had entered the marshland already. Still the road was deserted. Still there was no sign of the beaters or their masters. Lund had a suspicion, though, that this would not remain so much longer. The family groups found spots in the shade to sit down and eat. There was no time for fires or cooking, and the bread they had baked the night before had to do. The festival mood had been dampened somewhat, mostly by fatigue, but there was still wild speculation about their destination. The luxury of hopes and dreams was new to them, and something in which they now exulted. Lund and Cerwin moved among the sitting groups, listening to complaints, offering advice and comfort. Wherever they went there was a stir, and a few of the livelier little ones followed them around. It was astonishing how altered they were after only a few days on the road. There was shy laughter and skipping, and even little songs. The absence of their master's whips, the change of surroundings, the transformation in the demeanor of their elders, all these things were reflected in their sudden spontaneity and emerging expressions of joy. All too soon they were packing up again to continue their journey. The smallest of the children were hoisted onto the carts to ride with the infants, their little legs weary after the long morning march. Adults and older children took turns pulling the carts with their precious cargo along the rutted track, over which so many wagon loads containing the fruits of their labors had passed. By late afternoon the landscape had changed dramatically. Tufts of reedy grass whispered in the breeze around bowls of dry mud. The trees were smaller and stood in isolated clumps, stunted and defensive. Little clouds of insects descended upon them, gnat-like and harmless, flitting about for indiscernible reasons. The column pressed on over low mounds and through sulky ditches, where the low trees made little bowers of shade. They stared at the flat lands through which they marched, so treeless and barren, without hamlet or farmstead, empty and uninhabited. That evening there was a hush around the campfires, as if the silent lands beyond the sea of trees had imposed its nature on the travelers. In the morning, scouts reported a large walled structure to the north. It also appeared deserted. The gates were open and the towers unmanned. No smell of smoke could be detected. The road forked close to this fortress city, with one arm heading westwards and the other continuing north. It seemed that the Vran column would not be disturbed while passing by. Lund took Brith, Brennick, and 5 others to move ahead and explore this find. The beaters that had fled Grail had certainly passed through this region. If the information of the others were correct, they took the western road back to where they had come from. Yet there was a possibility that the Torque had pressed them back into service. This would be the place to spring their trap. The muddy walls of the place were much higher than those of Grail. Lund and his band were dwarfed by the imposing structure of the gatehouse. They slipped through like shadows, keeping their eyes on the watchtowers. The space inside the walls was occupied by row upon row of low-roofed buildings, fashioned of mud brick and reed. It was not a town where people lived and worked. It was a gigantic barracks. They moved through the streets and training squares, searching for storehouses and depots. Perhaps the departing warriors had left behind some supplies or weapons. Soon enough, Lund realized that a thorough search would require his entire force. There were entrances scattered over the city, leading to the underground, where a whole new world of warrens and dwellings was discovered. In the short time they had before the column arrived, Lund and his group found rooms with supplies that had undoubtedly been shipped here from the clearings in the Dankwood. There were even sealed barrels from the tanning yard with dates scribbled on the sides in charcoal. He shuddered to think that one of them could contain the remains of Moshta, the overseer. The camp was made outside the city walls that night. After their evening meal, the warriors went into the fortress and the underground in groups to report on anything useful they could locate. Only a few arms were found, yet there was clothing, threadbare but usable, as well as stores of wheat and rye. Extra rations were issued in the morning to celebrate these welcome discoveries. There were smiles and songs again, where there had been only awe and doubt the day before at the sight of such a mighty stronghold of the enemy. Even so, the column passed in silence under the battlements of the city on their way north that morning. Little eyes scanned the tall towers of the lookouts, the great house for the gate, the solid wall so high it blocked out half the sky. There were nervous glances at their elders, their guardians, their spears. The Torque had built this place and would have to be faced somewhere to the north. Banks of heavy cloud obscured the sun at noonday. An oppressive atmosphere heralded the coming of heavy rain. Still, by eventide there had not fallen but a few drops, though the stars could not be seen for the thick, woolly shroud above. Lund felt the apprehension of the hunting trail settle in his stomach. The land about him was nervous. The very grass and slimy embankments trembled with an unknown trepidation. Was it merely the coming of the rain that inspired such anxiety? Certainly not. Even though he was not familiar with the moods of this open, featureless countryside, it was apparent that something out of the ordinary was about to unfold. Ceridwen joined him at the fireside, her brow creased with concern.
You sense it too, don't you? Could it be there is a storm coming? Should we not turn back and hide in the city of the Torque?
He shook his head, keeping his eyes on the sky.
We have a good day's march back to that place. A storm will not harm us. The smallest ones can hide under the carts. But there is something else, something more than a storm approaching.
She looked at him quickly.
I fear you are right in that. All day long I felt it growing, like the coming of a terrible fever, getting stronger the further we traveled northwards. Could it be that something lies ahead? A strong place of the enemy?
Lund considered this. There could be truth in what she said. The threat was not simply natural. There was an element of the twisted magic of their former masters in the air.
I do not know. Our scouts will come back at daybreak. They may have the answer.
Gareth fretted to be moving about outside the little hovel. Both men went out for hours on end, while he had to sit inside, playing with his bow or rearranging the items in their packs. 3 days had passed since the dream of Lord Malik's host leaving for the north. Sufficient time for all to feel safe in approaching the Marsh King's lair. In the morning the three of them would head towards Lakeside. By nightfall, they would cross the wall and make their way to the gate. Janos knew where it was and how to access it. Now there was little to do but feed the low fire and watch the stewing supper. Gareth kept his eyes fixed on the small, dancing flames curling round the bottom of their cooking pot. The smell of Janos' collection of roots and the large hare they had trapped the day before, simmering together, drove back the damp earth and odor of the hovel, and made the place seem friendly and inhabitable. He would certainly carry away good memories of this little hole in the marshes. All those impossible words had come to him here, the fulfillment of his deepest longings. He brought them back to his memory, treasuring each phrase, each ray of meaning, basking in the warmth it brought to him. His gaze was fixed on the friendly flame, staring. Striding across the swampland, a little bewildered at first, came the ragged children. At their head walked the young man of the underground in the endless forest, openly, with a blade on his back. His stride was confident, his gaze unafraid. Leather armor covered his upper body, a single jewel lay on his chest. Lightning forked from the sky, but he did not flinch. The thousands who came behind did not falter either, but they watched him, as their guide and captain, placing their feet in his footsteps. There were spears and shields among them now, hundreds of youths and boys and stooping old ones, protecting all the mothers and small children, even babies riding in the line of carts. He knew that these Viron had escaped the terror of the south. They were pushing into the heart of Terrallen, towards Lakeside. A door opened behind him. Voices broke the spell. Only when he did not answer did they become concerned. Rune knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder.
What is it? Gareth?
He stared at the man with heavy eyes.
Were you sleeping?
Janos checked the back of his neck for blood.
Dreaming, more likely.
Gareth shook his head.
I was just thinking, and then I saw them. The slaves from the south. They're coming this way. We can meet them at Lakeside.
Slaves? What slaves?
Rune's mind went back to the mostly deserted slave markets of Nunmerik. Had there been a breakout?
From the great forests in the south, beyond the marshes. I saw them before. The faithful, hiding in the underground, and the great treasure the Marsh lord had concealed there.
Rune and Janos stared at each other.
What are you talking about, child?
Gareth glanced round at Rune in exasperation.
The forest! You saw it yourself. The dragon.
The man nodded. A prickling had started in the nape of his neck.
The forest? There were slaves there?
Viron slaves. Many. Thousands.
Thousands?
Rune could hardly believe his ears.
Does Garth know about this?
No. But Veer does. He showed me. I do not know how they escaped, but I saw them just now in the swampland, coming this way.
This is incredible.
Janos said.
Malik kept thousands of Viron as slaves, and he did not exterminate them before going north. That could not have been his intention. I doubt whether there are sufficient forces in Lakeside to complete the task now.
Rune turned back to Gareth.
Do you know how far away they are? When will they reach the city?
The boy frowned at him.
I'm not sure. They are on the side of the lake already. Tomorrow, perhaps?
Rune considered this carefully.
We will set out early and work our way round to the south of Lakeside. With good fortune, we may encounter them before they are within sight of the city itself, and lead them past it undetected. Where we will go from there is an open question. With so many, we cannot hope to sneak through the portal to the towers.
No,
Janos said.
it is very dangerous in the underground of Lakeside right now. The slightest misstep and there could be disastrous results. And I do not even bring the beast into consideration.
Beast?
Rune and Gareth looked at him quizzically. Memories returned to them. A huge gate in the underground, the rhythmic rattling of heavy chains, the vivid apprehension.
Did I not mention it?
Janos raised his eyebrows and looked at them as if he was convinced they were trying to deceive him.
It guards the gateway leading to the portal. A fire breather. Huge and potent, but spoiled. Not like the shifters. Oh no, this one is lost to them. So they found a use for it. A dangerous game, though, putting a beast like that among the vapors of the swamp pressing in, and they keep it so close to the seals. It is caged, so we could have made our way past with little danger, but the whole tribe of slaves.
He shook his head. They looked at one another. Rune remembered the armored bulk of the beast he had seen in the dank wood. The paralyzing fear of it washed over him again.
Oh,
Janos' exclamation made their heads turn in surprise. He pointed to the pot bubbling on the hearth.
that supper should be ready about now.
The dawn was an angry red affair, the coming sun like a threat of violence behind the broken heavy clouds in the east. The Vran were drawn up in their column. A change was made to the marching order. Lund brought all the warriors up to the front, with the exception of a small rear guard, to lead the way. In his mind the danger had multiplied since the night before. Ceridwen, her eyes as anxious as his, stood by his side. She spoke in low tones not to be overheard.
There is a great fear upon me. For all my words and pleas to go north, I am now afraid of what the Torque may do to us if we proceed.
Lund sighed heavily.
There is no choice but to go forward. We have to trust the winged man and the dreams he has sent us. But you are right, this is an evil day, and the end of it may see us safe or destroyed.
Brithael approached them, and Lund warned her with his eyes to say no more. Their friend looked tired and worn. A frown of discomfort creased his brow. Ceridwen reached up to check the rag tied round his temples.
Are you in pain?
He smiled wanly.
That's the oppressing air. Some of it must have reached into my head. Have no concern, it will pass soon enough, I'm sure.
He turned to Lund.
We are ready to move at your word.
Lund looked up and down the long column. What would this day's march bring? If the Torque had more Ronings up ahead, it could well be the end of the Vron band. In the open lands there was no place to hide and defend themselves. His fingers shook a little as he gave the signal to advance. Almost reluctantly he strode forward to lead the warriors. They set off into the glare, the massing clouds, the heavy air. For a while nothing was heard but the tramping of feet. The sound of so many marching behind brought a sense of comfort and security. How often it had been his footfalls alone, running in the forest, his breathing, and the beating of his racing heart. Now there were so many to share and support. They were skirting a huge sea of muddy shoals and scummy pools to the left, unending and vile, reeking of decay. The dry clumps of marsh grass and withered reeds stood silent as they passed. Nothing stirred in the bogs or among the low brush. Not a bird or creature rose to escape their approach. In the close air, only the tramping feet and rumbling cartwheels seemed to be alive. The column had not proceeded a mile when Brennick brought in the scout. Lund recognized him as Leogarth, the boy from the uprising in Grail. He seemed overly excited and halted 100 yards off, resting his hands on his knees, waiting for the column to reach him while he caught his breath. Brennick was literally dancing with impatience. When he reached the waiting pair, Lund motioned to them to fall in next to him. They could continue while Leogarth reported. The boy wasted no time.
There is a great Torque city to the north, on the verge of this foul lake.
He pointed to the drowned lands on their left.
We will reach it before last night.
Lund felt the apprehension tighten his stomach. This was the answer, then, to the riddle.
It is inhabited.
The boy nodded.
It is, though we could not see any guards on the wall. The people there are mostly old folks or women, but there could be warriors inside. It is as large as the other we saw. No, several times as large. And there is a dry ditch all the way around it. Thousands of tracks lead away from it to the north. Many, many warriors went that way.
Lund compared this with what he had heard in Grail. The great Torque would lead his host north to destroy their brothers. If he had left already, the Vron would have to hurry if they were to aid their fellows. There would be little danger from the city if all the fighters had departed for the struggle. He could lead the column past the Torque city and follow the tracks of the host. Why, then, did he still sense the dark threat on the horizon? Could it simply be the echo of the Master's force, the passing of such twisted beasts as they had fought in Grail, leaving their imprints on the ground ahead? There was little to do but move forward with all haste. Let the storm catch them in the open. Let the Torque watch from their walls. If they could not catch up to the terrible host ahead, there would be no refuge for them to reach, no haven to be free and secure among their own. Rune and his party had not proceeded a mile when he was forced to halt and draw the other two into a pocket of tall grass and stunted trees. He turned to Gareth and forced him to sit down. The boy was shaking as with fever, his teeth chattering and his eyes staring. Rune's whisper was urgent.
What's wrong with you? Gareth, look at me.
The boy shied away at his touch. His voice was hoarse.
I don't know. I'm afraid. Don't go there. Don't go to Lakeside.
Jaina spoke, giving Rune a start.
I am nervous also, as if we are on the wrong course here. Surely you feel it too?
Rune looked from one to the other. Certainly he was apprehensive, but not extraordinarily so, though the strange behavior of his companions made him ill at ease. He knelt down next to Gareth and gripped his arm.
We are not going to Lakeside, remember? We're just going to take a look, and then move round it to the east.
The eyes flashed at him.
Don't go near it, please. All the air is pressing in so, and the prince is so angry after all this time.
Prince? What prince?
There were tears in his eyes now.
Don't you see? She is in there.
He covered his face with his hands. Rune caught Janos' eye, who shrugged and shook his head.
Does he mean the queen?
It might be.
But she let us go. What danger is he talking about?
The underground of Lakeside is permeated with marsh vapors. Fire damp, they call it. Most of the tunnels are sealed off, but still it leaks through in places. In the dungeons, you can almost feel it crowding in about you.
Gareth dried his eyes with a sleeve and looked up. He had stopped shaking. For a moment he seemed puzzled to find himself seated in the brush. Rune noticed the change and sighed with relief.
Feeling better? Ready to go on?
The boy nodded and gave him a shy smile. He allowed himself to be pulled up by an arm. Rune turned to go and Gareth fell in behind him, with Janos bringing up the rear. The old man kept a concerned eye on the boy in front of him. If anything, his apprehension had deepened during the odd exchange. Gareth's seeming connection with Malik and his queen's motives and fears was at once convenient and disconcerting. The collar they had put on him still worked a magic, if less potent and not harmful. Rune strode through the grasses and reeds with a purpose. The malevolent sky and oppressive air did nothing to assuage his anxiety. He would keep his distance from Lakeside, however, since the boy was so strangely worked up about it. All the portents and dreams were getting on his nerves. The noonday sun was high above, hidden in the grey mass, when they reached the roadway leading down to the Bagrat Bridge. A warm wind was sweeping over the flatland, setting the shrub and grass astir, and making ripples on the dark pools. In the east, far-off flashes of lightning could be seen. Gareth stared at it with large eyes. Nunmerik was still out of sight to the southwest, yet he glanced down the road for the slaves and their leader to step out of his dream and stride through the stabbing swords from the darkened heavens. The three made their way down to the bridge with care. There could be watchmen from Lakeside here. When they came in sight of it, Rune had the two others wait while he scouted ahead. There was no one on the road, and the structure appeared deserted. He hurried back to fetch his companions. They would have to hasten southwards to head off the slaves. Brennick brought a message from Lathan asking for an hour's rest at midday. Lund halted the column soon after. He sent a boy back to forbid the making of fires. On the northern horizon a dark line had appeared, rising slightly out of the surrounding marshland. No doubt this was the Torque stronghold. They would eat their meal within sight of it. Soon they would leave the road to skirt round the structure. The dismal day could well mask their presence from the enemy. Already scattered drops were falling and the wind had freshened. Ceridwen brought food for the two of them from the carts. Together they stood and ate it, all the while scouting the land to the east for a convenient place to enter the bog. It would be slow going over the uneven, soggy ground, and they had to consider the carts. Drawn by hand, these could easily sink into muddy patches and would have to be dragged out with much toil. The bramble thicket, like a hedge, kept the western side of the roadway. Scarcely 20 yards from where they stood with their backs turned, a figure stirred ever so slowly, crawling away into the marshland, taking care to keep the hedge between himself and the standing pair. Soon he was bold enough to stumble away with a hobbling gait, unseen, towards the city. The breeze helped him along from behind and masked the noises of his frantic passage. His back turned to the hedge, Lund took a few steps closer to the eastern edge of the roadway. There was no clear passage among the pools and tufts of grass. Perhaps half a mile or so up the road the prospects would improve. They could risk going a little closer to the stronghold. A move from that direction would be reported by the scouts long before it could reach them. The Vran scouts were the first to see the rushing, exhausted figure hasten up the road from the south. A lone watchman had appeared on the wall of the city since midday. Even though they suspected the old man of bringing tidings of the Vran column to the Torque here, they could not risk being seen and having the alarm raised if they ventured out of hiding to stop him. Soon enough, the spearman on the wall saw the hobbling Marshlander approaching the gate. He called out to him, and receiving no response, shouted to the guard-room below to fetch the sergeant. 2 more figures appeared on the wall to gaze where he was pointing, then promptly disappeared again. They met the rushing old one in the gateway. In astonishment, they listened to his shouting and wild gesticulating. A host of Viron had appeared in the south and were heading towards Nunmerik. Yes, he was sure. He had been close enough to see their eyes. He had sneaked away when they were halted for a meal. How many? 10,000 at least. Spears and shields and armor, and some had blades. Quickly the gate was secured, amid threats from the sergeant that the old one would be ripped limb from limb if his claims proved to be a hoax. But the terror of the man was real enough to convince all the hearers of the truth of his story. Elena sat in her garden, waiting for the storm to break. For 2 days the clouds had been gathering over Lakeside, and the wind had started, warm and moist, heralding the violence of the rainy season. Around her the birds were silent, their cages covered and dark. The leaves rustled and stirred in the blow, like a crowd whispering together. She could imagine what they were saying. Malik had gone off to his war, and she remained, having betrayed him at last. The master of deceit had been deceived himself. Or had he? Would he deal with her once Myril lay at his feet, and his last enemies were vanquished? She shuddered at the thought. What he would do to her she could picture all too clearly. Did she not deserve it? All she had ever loved had felt her betrayal. The 2 sons were lost to her. No companion remained who did not suspect or despise her. Here she remained in a dusty, rotting town with her withered heart, still beating for no purpose she could discern. This was what it had to be like to grow old. If only the rain would start. The thick air swirled about her, dragging the leaves and dust into eddies of flying debris, the pieces of her life in pointless motion. Elena looked up suddenly as the servant hurried through the doorway. The sergeant of the day watch stood just outside, panting. Something of grave importance had occurred. She rose to her feet.
Pardon the intrusion, Queen Elena. The sergeant has an urgent report to make.
Impatiently, she motioned the man forward. He bowed low. Swallowing her irritation, she bid him rise and report.
A great host of Viron have been spotted on the southern road. Your Highness, perhaps 10,000 strong, and marching this way.
She was utterly astonished. An enemy host? On the southern road? She frowned at the man, who cringed away.
There is absolute certainty that this is the truth.
The sergeant hesitated but a moment before replying in the affirmative. He had already convinced himself of the validity of the report before he decided to warn the Queen. Elena stood aghast. How could Malik have miscalculated so badly? Where had this host come from? Had she not seen the destruction of Fengor and his pathetic ally on the river Darkweed? Here she was with 20 wretched marshland warriors to protect her. Nunmerik was defenseless. Unless... The wild horror rose up in her. Would she even acknowledge the existence of Malik's vilest creation? Would she stoop to unleash such cruel terror as Kale had, and save herself by destroying all others around her? How would she face him again afterwards? How would she pass judgment when he was to be destroyed? What was she to do then? Was there time to flee the place? Would he stop her in the portal veil?
How far away? When will they be here?
Before nightfall, Your Highness. What are we to do?
She hesitated. What irony that she had let that little Viron prince go just to fall into the hands of his countrymen. She could head overland to the coast, leave the city to the enemy. Yet, why would she escape? What remained to her even if Malik was victorious? Would it not be better to remain here to be taken by the Viron? Perhaps she would see him again, explain to him. Her sudden laugh made the men stare at her in shock.
Do what you think fit, Sergeant. I will remain in the garden if anyone is searching for me. You may go.
The men bowed in utter amazement. They turned simultaneously, not daring to catch each other's eye in case they see the terrible suspicion mirrored there. Queen Elena had lost her mind. The sergeant made his way to the underground barracks to call out the night watch. Perhaps the approaching force could be bluffed into accepting their surrender on favorable terms. He would try to populate the walls with what seemed like a sizable force. Even as he considered this, despair overtook him. A paltry 20 men would not impress anyone. Perhaps he could arm the wretches in the streets and marketplaces. A desperate thought entered his mind. Deep in the subterranean fastness remained a terrible power, a beast to rival Horan himself. Would it not be able to withstand the approaching enemy, to wreak havoc upon them on the open road and thus save the city? It had to be freed from its prison, allowed to escape from the pit where it was held. He had to hurry. With the queen in such a state, there was no one in command of the city. Not a priest remained in Nunmerik. All the responsibility for the defense of the place now fell on him alone. The guards were roused from their sleep and dispatched to the wall. He kept 2 men with him to help with the gate and heavy chains of the cage. They were not informed about where they were going or what they would do there. Men were very nervous when they had to deal with a monster that used to be the prince of the tour and Horan's heir. He was unpredictable and moody, often uncontrollable and fierce, attacking those who merely came to feed him. But this day they had need of him like never before. He would have to defend his home and his mother. Swiftly, he led the men down into the bowels of the underground. By the time they reached the great gate, his companions understood the desperate situation and the need to complete their dangerous assignment. The great lock opened and the chain was pulled back. The gate swung wide. The great beast was aware of the humans before they touched the lock on the outer gate. He sensed their fear, their need, their amusing illusion of control. They were here to challenge him, not merely to feed him with some dead carcass, but to make him obey and dance to their every whim. He would wait for them, like the prey he craved above all else, to make sport of them and see them writhe in terror before the end. The need rose up in him, the great appetite for hurt and cruelty. It consumed him, set him quivering with anticipation. Nothing else existed now. This had been his life forever. He could not remember his name or his origin. Neither had he the need for such, when there was power enough to satisfy the seemingly limitless cravings of his monstrous frame. They opened the inner gate, 3 of them, and proceeded to loose the heavy chain that kept him bound to the floor. He felt the trembling in his wings, but did not move. He heard the jabbering of their voices, but it made no sense to him. They would release him, set him free to go where he pleased. He would take his revenge on these pathetic creatures before making his escape. The saliva had started in his mouth, and the blood was drumming inside him so loudly that there was no more room for speculation. He screamed when the last fetter was removed, and watched them cringe in horror, the little men running feebly for the far wall and the openings into which they would crawl for safety. One he tore before it could reach a hiding place. He took his time killing it, though it was so frail, to make the others squirm. The next was hiding in a tunnel, its back pressed against the clay seal. He reached in with a claw and heard the screaming above the pulsing of his blood. There was a stab of pain as the little thing tried to defend itself. He reached in more forcefully, breaching the clay of the seal. His prey escaped through the crack, retreating beyond his reach. Fury rose up in him, making him tear at the opening with violence, though the earthen walls were furrowed and broken. Yet he could not widen the tunnel sufficiently to allow him access to the chamber beyond. His anger abated as he considered the situation. This little man would not escape him. Fire could reach where his claws could not. They had starved him these many cycles of the food required to produce it. Yet he knew there was still enough to scorch the prey already pressing itself against the next sealed entrance. Slowly, ecstatically, he drew in his breath. Half a mile beyond the bridge, Rune signaled his two companions to halt again. The city of Non-Merrick sprawled ahead of them in the distance. The slaves would certainly steer clear of it, making their way round it to the east, since the lake itself would prevent them from going west. Gareth was trembling once more. His gaze was fixed on the skyline where the city lay visible over 3 miles away. Janos huddled down behind him, staring in the same direction. Rune was about to ask the boy whether he felt sick again when it happened. A tremendous blast, deep below the ground, rumbled beneath them. The shock of it had them squat down or be knocked off their feet. A series of resounding blasts followed in quick succession, ending in a huge explosion directly beneath the city. In a moment, the walls, the ramparts, the taller structures were all engulfed in a gigantic ball of swirling flame. The noise was terrific, a tearing of the ground in many places, the broken buildings sliding into pits and crevices. Columns of dust, reaching to 1 mile in height, stood up from the surrounding countryside, covering the city in its dying agony. Even where they huddled together, dirt and clods of earth started sifting down. Great cracks had appeared in the ground on the far side of the river, with flames reaching out of them and lapping at the low brush and grasses. Rune had one arm around Gareth, his free hand held onto Janos' sleeve. It was hard to believe what he had seen, impossible to express his astonishment. The old man was the first to speak. His voice was an awed whisper.
The fire damp.
He tore his eyes away from the terrible scene to stare at his companions.
I knew they were fools to keep sealing it in.
He shook Gareth's shoulder.
Didn't I tell you, boy? Miles and miles of tunnels, abandoned because of the creeping vapors.
Rune was beginning to understand.
What could have set it off?
Janos shrugged.
Any spark in the wrong place, a torch, a lamplighter, and the whole rotten mess is blown apart.
A sudden realization came to him.
And our portal with it.
Rune brushed the settling sand and debris from his shoulders.
Not that we could use it with the slaves approaching.
He peered through the murk in the direction where Non-Merrick had been, and prodded the motionless form in front of him.
Gareth?
The boy raised the sleeve to his eyes. He had not heard a word of what the men had spoken. All his thoughts were with the Queen and her great struggle that had finally found an end. Yet her sadness would endure, and her passing from Myrtle would go unsung and unmourned. In all her warped wisdom, she had not been able to see this unfolding. In his heart he knew that she had been at least a little pleased that the children of Sear, so long enslaved and tortured by Malik, had brought about, if unwittingly, the fiery destruction of the festering wound that was Lakeside. At the first shaking of the ground, Lund drew the blade and extended it. He felt the quick, violent repetition under his feet, and thought the Torque monsters would ambush them from below. Behind him there was pandemonium on the roadway. The startled, fearful children did not scream or even cry out, but their carts veered wildly or came to an abrupt halt as they attempted to clear the road and find refuge in the swamp. The warriors huddled down, looking about them in consternation. Then, as unexpectedly as it had come, it was over. The torn ground, from great fissures reaching almost to where they stood so amazed, belched forth balls of fire, reaching up into the ominous sky. The dust came sifting down upon them, but no beasts rose from the abyss to scatter and pursue the little ones. No loathsome destroyers descended upon their quivering warriors. The imposing Torque city on the side of the lake had disappeared from view, ripped apart by the tremendous blasts, and dragged piece by piece into the hollows opened up beneath it. Lund waited, his senses trembling, while the warm wind swept away the blinding cloud of sand. This suffocating screen would be the perfect cover for a Torque attack. Yet the pressing threat that had hung over them from the day before had lifted, and he could not perceive the presence of any potent enemy. Slowly, the air cleared of debris and dust, revealing only the devastation done to what had been. There were no battle cries, or sounds of rushing warriors exploiting their disrupted state. Nothing stirred but the swirling eddies of sand, the dismayed shrub and reed. Thunder sounded from the sky above, and the shields came up in readiness, but there was nothing to descend upon them from the darkness. Lightning touched the marsh not a mile away, and the rolling drums were deafening, but no priests emerged to strike at them with blows they could not parry or resist. Lund waited still, though the bright blades drew closer and closer. Heavy drops began to fall, 1 and 2 and dozens. Soon the clouds opened and poured down on the hulking Vron, a flood that soaked them within moments. The spell of astonishment dissipated. Little ones ran for the carts and huddled underneath. Older ones drew capes and hoods over their heads. No attack materialized. No enemy rushed out to hurt and maim. Could it be that the sudden eruption had not been a deliberate attempt to ambush them? But then the city itself could not have been so utterly demolished. Had the Torque done this to themselves? Had it been by design or accident? What power had they harnessed to bring about such terrible devastation? They looked to the north. The roadway remained intact, at least for another mile. Where it turned towards the former city, the cracks had breached its curving line. Here they would have to find another way. At least there would be no more threat from the fortress. The incredible display had been too destructive to be a ruse. No hidden Torque host could be lurking in the fissures. He sheathed the blade and straightened up from the crouch into which the first noise had forced him. He called Brennick to his side and dispatched him to find Lathan. The heavy downpour gave them the opportunity to replenish their supplies of water. Soon enough the torrents abated to a gentle rain. The lightning continued for a while, even after the column had reformed and was underway once more. As they proceeded, Lund kept glancing to his left to where the city had been. Its destruction was a mystery to him still, and he could not decide whether it was at all connected with their appearance here on this day. Had the Torque even been aware of their approach? If so, would it not have been prudent to determine whether the former slaves posed a threat or not? The rain stopped entirely after another hour, having moved on to the west, and taken the rumbling thunder with it. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds to the north, seemingly pointing the way for them. The driving wind softened to a whisper. Under the turning wheels of the carts and the tramping feet, the road was turned into mud, slowing the column to a crawl. Despite their need to push on, it might be more expedient to rest the weary legs and camp for the night. In the morning there would be an improvement in conditions, and they would be well prepared for a long march. Perhaps he would take Brennick and a few others to see what was left of the Torque City. Soon, to everyone's relief, the halt was called. The ban on fires was lifted, and within moments the hunt was on for fuel. Carts were converted into little homes, family groups received their rations. Lund left Brithael in charge of the camp and guards. He picked Brennick, Ryn, and 2 others for a quick scouting tour of the area to the northwest. They set off at a trot, eager and curious. Yet they had not gone 100 yards before Lund halted them in consternation. On the roadway ahead stood 3 figures, apparently awaiting them. No doubt the 3 could see the large numbers behind them, yet they appeared bold and unafraid. Lund searched the open swamp around them for signs of enemies. There was no place to hide a goat, much less a Torque warrior. There could be no ambush waiting. No, the 3 wanted to be noticed, wanted to meet them. Before approaching the strangers, he sent for Brith and 10 more warriors. There was no reason to become reckless. While they waited for the reinforcements, he noticed the 3 slowly coming down the road towards them. One of the 2 taller ones was armed. The others appeared to carry nothing but their packs. They were travelers, and would therefore not have come from the city. Perhaps they were not Torque at all, though it would be strange to find anyone in this land who was not an ally of the dreaded masters. Mayhap they were like the beaters in Grail, who merely wanted to pass on to their own homeland in the west. He would question them thoroughly about the road north before letting them go on. Brith came up in great excitement. He had seen the strangers by now and was as curious as the rest of them. Lund motioned to his group to advance. He did not want to appear overly cautious. The smaller figure was a boy, about Brennick's size. Lund felt a strange sensation when looking at him. Instantly he realized the truth. It was a Vran boy. His gaze shifted to the gray-haired man on his left. There was power there, behind the mask of age and frailty, wisdom and much experience, a touch of core, and strangely, of Lurin. The man on the right carried a blade on his hip. He was Vran too, and startlingly familiar. It was the one from the clearing on the line in the Dankwood. He moved in the same way, carried his head proudly, like a master. His eyes were piercing and challenged whoever they beheld. A man of intensity. He was used to being surrounded by enemies. Distrust and hatred were close companions. Somewhat like Lund himself. For one hunted by overpowering adversaries, the signs were plain to see. A constant scrutiny of the land about him, the sword hand never far from the hilt, an awareness of the position and possible threat of all those about him. All these things he betrayed in the slight shifting of his gaze, the setting of his brow, the lithe gait and clenched fingers. Would this man recognize him from so long ago? He thought not. Perhaps he had not even seen the poor slave trapped in his tree. There had been a destroyer about, after all, to occupy his full attention. Both parties slowed as they came together. The 3 halted a few yards away, and Lund's companions stopped also, uncertainly. By now everyone realized that 2 of the strange visitors were Vran. There was no threat or suspicion in their minds, only overwhelming curiosity. Lund found his gaze oddly drawn to the boy in the center. With 2 such imposing companions, it was strange that this should be the case. Yet neither of the men with him made any move as the group stood staring at each other. It was the child who stepped forward and broke the silence. Smiling at Lund, he said,
You are the faithful one.
He was 2 paces away, his eyes fixed on Lund's.
I do not know your name.
He reached out his hands and gripped the one Lund offered him tightly. His smile faded suddenly into a sad frown of understanding.
I am so glad you escaped that place.
Lund found his heart racing. The speech was slightly different in sound, but undoubtedly their own. Here were people of their blood from beyond the trees, born not as slaves, but something else, something he wanted to be also. He found his voice.
My name is Lund. I lead these people. Fran, like you, from the forests in the south. Whence do you know me?
The smile spread over the boy's face again, a little shyly this time.
My name is Gareth Seth Rune, from Viron in the far north. I saw you in dreams, in the underground, when you found the great hoard from which you drew your blade.
He pointed to the weapon on Lund's back. There was movement to the side as Brennick stepped forward. He was staring open-mouthed at the boy in front of Lund. Gareth returned the look of amazement. He took in the healing scar on the cheek, the large eyes, the flaxen hair.
I saw you too, and I you and that man.
The boy indicated the one carrying the blade. Gareth turned as Rune stepped forward. He waved an arm dramatically in his direction.
This is Prince Rune, from Viron,
He gained a little color.
my father.
Rune reached out a hand also to grip the one offered by the slave leader. Their eyes met. Lund felt for his mind, more out of habit than in the hope of any result. To his utter amazement, he sensed resistance and saw the other's brow crease.
Oh no, none of those strange intrusions. My head seems like a crowded marketplace, and every second person I meet has found a way in.
Gareth laughed, and Lund realized that there was no animosity in the declaration. He shrugged.
Prince Rune, I have seen you before, in the evil lands of the south, on the border of the hunting trails. You gave me hope.
Rune frowned at him. Could it be?
You are the one I saw in the tree. You fell when the dragon charged at you.
The pale head nodded energetically.
I did not know that you saw me, but I knew then that there were others like me outside the Sea of Trees. I knew the legends had to be true.
Gareth turned to the still staring boy.
You saw me in a dream. I saw both of you in the cave when the winged man came.
Gareth gave a start.
The winged man? You saw Veer in the underground? Veer? Who is Veer? Veer is his name. You are a child of Veer. Veer Han. He is the father of our people.
A look of understanding settled on the boy's brow.
We say Fran, but it should be Veer Han.
Lund interrupted.
The winged man, Veer. He is in the north?
Rune nodded.
We were on our way there when we noticed you coming up through the swamplands. We lingered here to lead you past Lakeside.
He pointed in the direction of the scarred land.
No, it is no longer necessary.
What happened to it? Lakeside is the name. I thought it was some sort of trap at first.
Rune turned to the older man with him.
Janos here believes it was an accident, that the tour brought fire to the vapors in the underground. These had accumulated over many hundreds of cycles and were ignited this day.
It was the prince. They kept him confined down there because of the state that he is in.
Gareth's voice brought all the eyes to bear on him.
But I felt his anger and his despair. Perhaps they tried to free him, but he would not be controlled. It was his fire that set the air alight.
Lund understood.
This tour, they are the masters we call Torque. And this their prince you mentioned, he was a beast that breathes fire.
He was.
Janos answered.
Yet he was trapped in that form, a Ronin.
Gareth looked at his companions in puzzlement.
Ronin, a name for the failures, the ones who are trapped.
It made sense at last. Lund continued.
He is the first Ronin I know of that could breathe fire. The ones in Grail cannot.
Rune did not miss the implications of what he said.
Ones. There are more of these. Are they like the dragon we saw in the forest?
Lund met his questioning eyes.
That one is dead. It was the most powerful, the destroyer meant to consume all of us. Many times more powerful than the Ronins, and full of fire.
Rune could not believe his ears. Immense relief washed over him.
It is dead, you say? Who killed it?
Lund smiled.
It is quite a tale to tell.
He put an arm round the shoulders of the boy named Brennick.
This one had the greatest share in it, though many gave their lives.
Rune shook his head.
This one.
He looked the boy over from head to toe. Brennick's wide stare was fixed on him, the corners of his mouth betraying a smile of mischief.
Now I know you are exaggerating.
Lund and his group laughed loudly, a pleasant sound.
It was slain by the Ronins in the end, but the meeting had to be arranged.
There was more laughter at this. A dark-haired youth, a little taller than the rest, stepped forward.
He fails to tell you who drew out the beast and faced him alone in the pit, who ran the risk for all of us.
Lund held up a hand.
Brithael likes to sing my praises, since he believes himself in my debt.
The youth stared at him, feigning mortification. Lund continued.
But we will tell you all there is to know about the fall of the great destroyer. Come and join us round the fires. If there are no more Ronings about, we have little to fear.
He motioned for them to follow and turned back towards the line of carts on the roadway. Excited chatter broke out as soon as there was no more exchange of words. The little band of Viron crowded round the newcomers as they fell in behind Lund. Brennick joined himself to Gareth to pose the questions milling in his mind.
We have learned about the Northland from others we have questioned. What is it like? Is it far away? What will we find when we get there?
Gareth waved away the barrage.
I will make a bargain with you.
He said.
A bargain? Yes. I will answer one of your questions, but not another, before you answer one of mine.
Brennick grinned at him.
Agreed.
Gareth briefly told him about the rolling hills round Belruth, the meadows and farmlands, the tall mountains of the northwest. Then he countered with a question of his own.
Were you always in the underground? No. We were trapped there for the last 5 or 6 10 days. Before that, I was mostly in the forest during the day. I was training to be a runner. Only at night were we shut up in the cells in the running pit. A runner? The masters would hunt some of us every 10th day. We had to train hard to give them a challenge.
Gareth was utterly astonished.
Hunt you? With bows?
The boy nodded.
Bows, spears, anything they wanted. And there were traps to slow us down and beaters to prevent us from hiding. No one survived for long. Lund,
He pointed ahead.
was a champion runner. He survived 7 hunts and a royal hunt. That one I was in as well, but it lasted for days. He even killed a hunter once and several beaters. Wait,
Brennick stared at him suspiciously, as if he believed himself tricked into giving away too much information for a single question.
it's my turn now.
He thought carefully how to phrase his question in order to make it as broad as possible.
Your father is a prince, right? Will he be the king of the North Country? Oh, no. That is just a title now. He was forced out by my uncle, who was the real king. He was a wicked and selfish man, and he hated me. And he killed my mother.
It is Brennick's turn to be astonished.
He killed her.
Gareth looked down at the muddy ground.
Well, he did not do it himself, but he stole her away from my father, and then he did not want her anymore, so he had the priests force her to kill herself.
It sounded terribly blunt and brutal, even to him, but that was the painful truth.
He is dead now, killed by the swarm, and I'm not sorry.
They were approaching the camp. Brennick had fallen silent. Gareth did not feel to ask anything else just yet. The bitter words lay between them like a barrier. The slave boy looked up at him one last time.
I do not know who my father is.
His eyes were crystal pools in the fading light. Gareth saw the longing there that had almost consumed him. His heart seemed to shrink in sympathy.
I did not know who mine was for most of my life. He did not know me till but a few days ago.
Brennick stopped abruptly, causing those behind almost to blunder into him. He grabbed Gareth's arm.
Truly? How did you know?
Gareth grinned at him.
You are cheating. It is my turn to ask.
The boy looked so forlorn that he apologized immediately.
I was only teasing you. I saw it in a dream, and he heard some others talk of it much later.
The waiting group realized there would be no progress for a while and stepped round them. Brennick took no notice of them.
Do you think I could have a dream like that?
Gareth stared at him. What was he to say? He shrugged, then waved a finger.
That is another question, you know.
Rune stared at the long column of people stretching away into the distance. Fires were burning all along the line, small blazes for cooking and not warmth. There was little enough to fuel the flames in this land of grass and brush. What firewood they carried had to be conserved for the unknown road ahead. They passed among the armed vanguard, amidst the curious stares of mere children and older men, all huddled round their boiling pots or sprawled on the verge waiting. A girl, her hair long and loose, pale like Aethera's, came to meet them. Lund introduced her as Ceridwen. Rune almost envied them the quick smiles, the obvious delight in each other's company. She led them to a larger blaze than the rest, where the entire party seated themselves. Something was being prepared for their supper, and despite Rune's protestations that they were well supplied, it was clear the newcomers were expected to partake of it. While they waited, there was no lack of conversation. So many explanations had to be exchanged that no one was in a hurry to break off the speech for supper. Soon people from neighboring fires crowded in, forming an ever larger circle around Lund's group. A hush fell over all as they strained to hear what was being discussed. Rune listened in fascination as the account of Lord Malik's doings in his hidden world was given in stark particulars. As it unfolded, he was brought to a full realization of the extent of that ancient's hatred for the issue of Veer. Lund's voice rose above the evening songs of the marsh insects, the occasional call of the night birds, the crackling of the flames.
As children, we are separated from those who gave birth to us without ever knowing who they were. We are brought to the fields to plow, to plant, to weed and hoe, or to the orchards to prune and pick. A few unlucky boys are sent to the tanning yard to slaughter the animals and treat the skins. All are beaten cruelly. Some are taken for the tables of the masters here in the north. At 12 cycles, the males are brought to Grail for training, either in the running trails where they will be hunted for trophies, or the feeding pits for training to die in the arena. Those not selected for Grail are sent to the mines in the far east, where they are broken by overwork and too little nourishment.
There was no resistance to these atrocities.
Rune wondered.
Oh, there was. Though it was not easy to organize anything, the Viron, were forbidden speech. They were locked in individual cells when not chained together for work or training. There were large numbers of guards, well armed and trained. We were never alone, never had an opportunity to speak in private. Everyone was afraid, brutalized from when they were able to form their first clear thought. I remember my arrival in Grail, a trembling boy, convinced I was about to die in the most cruel way imaginable. If it had not been for Kor, I would have lost my reason. He was our listener, hidden in the depths of the underground. I heard his voice in my mind, speaking of hope and deliverance, when my world was one of anguish and despair. He led me through the running trails and protected me on the hunt. If a slave would tell you of my supposed accomplishments, know the truth, that it was his doing, for the greater part, and my good fortune that kept me from perishing, despite the foolishness of my actions.
Berthale interrupted.
Your foolish actions were so much greater than any other's heroism.
He turned to face Rune.
This one saved others on the hunt, and became our great hope, our champion, who alone could face the power of the Torque and prevail. When we were to be exterminated in the Ronin pits, he was the one to devise a strategy for our survival. And when it came to facing the Beater host, his sword broke their ranks and filled them with fear. It is true, though, that he was fortunate, for many times I despaired of seeing him alive again, but there was always someone to stand with him, and many times we found ourselves strong.
Rune pointed to the blade on Berth's back.
These blades, when did you acquire them? Did the tour have them locked away somewhere?
In a way,
Replied Lund.
they were concealed in the underground, a great hoard, and these boys
He pointed to the bowed heads on his right.
discovered it while exploring for a way out.
Brannick looked up.
We were afraid of the cave. There were whispers and strange figures.
Lund laughed and touched the boy on his shoulder.
They thought it was a ghost, but it was the winged man, speaking in dreams and visions. I saw you while I was in there,
He pointed to Gareth.
and you too, and I glimpsed the Northland and great battles to come.
Brannick addressed Rune again.
I saw you there also, the way you came over the road today.
Rune stared at him. an odd sensation taking hold of him. A question was burning in his mind.
When did you see this?
Lund and Brennick looked at each other. The boy spoke first.
16 days ago.
Rune calculated the time. It was when his party had arrived in Munborg, before the betrayal, the terrible failure. These ones had known that he would walk down this marshland road before he had decided to turn around for his son. Had it been a certainty then? Or had the seer merely gazed down the stream of time to this moment of meeting? Another blonde-haired boy next to him looked up at Rune. His voice was uncertain, reserved.
I have seen you too, in that cave under the city of Grail.
Rune met the eyes, saw the awe and reverence there. The boy rose up to kneel next to him, cradling something in his arms.
This belongs to you.
He held out a blade, wrapped in the ragged remains of a tunic, the hilt protruding. All the murmurings about them ceased. All eyes turned to Rune, then to the blade. Lund recognized it at once, so did Brennick. Both drew in their breath. Gareth gave a start. His eyes widened. In an instant he was on his knees next to the boy. The hilt was decorated with a single sleeping gem around which curled the flaming inlays of gold. It could not be. He gripped the boy's arm.
Where did you get this?
Ren appeared startled but recovered quickly.
It was waiting for me, in the cave.
There were whispers now, and movement, as the onlookers craned their necks to see what was happening. Gareth reached out a trembling hand to touch the blade.
Do you know what this is?
His voice rose above all the noise around. Rune and Lund stared at him. Gareth felt the familiar rush of blood, the prickling in his temples. He knew dreams were coming true all around him. He could scream and shout with it. Grabbing the hilt of the blade, he raised it to the sky. He stumbled to his feet, into the center of the ring. The rags fell away. The fire of the chrysolite flowed in amber potency, extending the length of the blade at least a foot beyond anything they had seen.
Merlotin!
There was a shout now. Perhaps it had come from him. Eyes were fixed on him, bewildered, awed. The light of the fire and the dazzling weapon were reflected in dozens of staring copper orbs. Gareth was suddenly intensely aware of their ties of blood, their shared legacy. These onlookers were Virhan, unspoiled and true, as vital and pure as the firstborn. What a gift they had brought from the dark Southland.
This is the father of all blades, the first one formed, whose fashioning could not be repeated.
He brought it low again and held it out to Rune.
This is the blade of Finwith, the dragon slayer.
Only the crackling of the fire could be heard. Rune passed his tongue over dry lips and swallowed nervously. The display had brought intense discomfort to his mind, as if he had ingested a hallucinogenic substance, and could not trust his perception or judgment. There was fear too, primal and disconcerting, raising the hairs in his neck. He half expected the master of Aaron Inrath to step out from the shadows. He looked at the kneeling boy, the hilt of the blade extended towards him. He felt the breathless expectation of all the Viran gathered about, and tried to speak. A few words tumbled out.
You looked for this in Finvale.
Gareth had a look of ecstasy on his face. His eyes were large and glowing like gems.
You heard him.
He motioned with his head in Rin's direction.
This belongs to you. They have found it, and it is yours to claim.
Uncertainty washed over the man. His hands were dirty, bloody. What was this magic, crowding all about him, making it difficult to breathe? He could not tear his gaze away from the hilt, the gem, the snaking gold.
Take it.
It was a voice of rapture, of complete and overwhelming confidence. His hesitation melted away. Rune gripped the hilt. Slowly, he rose to his feet. For a moment he thought the whispers multiplied, or the wind freshened once more. For the rush of blood in his ears, the cascading of consciousness, grew till he heard nothing else, was aware only of the warmth in his palm, like that of another living thing, potent and reassuring, impelling and true. He touched it with his thought, and felt the familiar response, only it was augmented to such a degree that he was afraid of losing himself. The blade extended like before, growing heavy and full, an amber glow at its heart. Bewildering notions rushed into his head. Stars and strangers whirled about, till he staggered and brought the blade low again, quenching the fierce fire. Rune was shaken, but pretended otherwise. He was suddenly irritated with the spectators gaping at him. What did they want to see? Some miracle? He was a man only, perhaps not even strong enough to wield such a weapon. Gareth was at his side, covering the blade with its rag again. He noticed the sudden doubt, the weakness, and subtly steered Rune back to his seat. He felt guilty for thrusting the responsibility on someone who was not ready for it. As soon as the man was seated again, Gareth asked Lund about the Ronings.
Did you destroy all the failed shifters, the Ronings?
Lund tore his eyes away from Rune and the blade.
No, they're there still, locked in their cages by Brennick and Run.
He nodded in the direction of the boys who had given Rune the blade. In his turn he asked,
There are more like the Destroyer who can breathe fire.
Many more. Gone north with a tour host to destroy all the lands and all the Viron.
He looked troubled.
What's left of them?
Tell me of the war in the north.
Gareth took a deep breath. He glanced at Janos and Rune. Both nodded to him.
Lord Malik wants to destroy all the Viron in Nuria, the Northland. He has set loose an ancient scourge, called the Swarm, to overrun all the lands from here to there. The Nurian king, my uncle, is slain, with his host and most of his allies. We do not know what forces remain in the Northland, but Lord Malik has taken his host and his dragons and his legions to destroy utterly whatever remains there. Lord Karth, a friend of the Viron, is trying to gain the forces of Aaron from across the sea to withstand these hordes from the south. Even if they decide to help, there is little hope. Who will face the beasts?
He glanced down at Rune, wincing. The eager confidence of earlier had completely disappeared. Lund's voice broke through his somber thoughts.
We are going north to help our brothers. There is nowhere we can hide to escape the Tour Lord's hatred. We will resist him there or be overcome.
The discussion ceased for a while as the evening meal was distributed. The crowd dispersed to find their own suppers at the fires they had left. Quickly the news and opinions spread through the camp. There was much danger in the north, and beasts worse than the Ronings. But the strangers counted among them a man who could wield a weapon that had slain such monsters. Rune ate the gruel in silence. It lacked seasoning, and only once did he look up to meet the eye of Janos. The old man motioned in the direction of their packs. Perhaps their hosts would not be offended if he added a little something to the meal. Rune hid a quick smile. Ceridwen brought them bread when they had emptied their bowls, and some dried fruit. Gareth smiled at her and nodded his head in thanks. To his surprise, he felt the touch of her thought.
You see things others cannot, and listen to the secrets of the enemy.
He replied instinctively, without hesitation.
I do.
She smiled.
I am so glad you have come to us.
Gareth remembered Karth's words and was amazed. Ceridwen was related to him, closely enough for speaking in this way. How strange it was. When they had had their fill, the group dispersed to find their bedrolls and look for dry places to sleep. Rune was grateful that there would be no more discussion this evening. He was tired and a little overwhelmed by all that had transpired. There were stars peering through the cloud cover now, and the chance of further rain seemed remote. He would bed down right there next to the fire. Janos had the same inclination, and pulled the woolen blanket from his pack. He spread it out with a sigh of satisfaction, as if that was what he had been waiting for all evening. Rune grinned to himself as he loosened his girdle and placed the blade on the ground beside it. Gareth knelt next to him and pointed to it. An eager voice spoke in the man's ear.
You don't need that anymore.
I don't.
You have that big one now. You can give me your old one.
Rune laughed softly.
What do you want with a blade? You'll slice off your own nose.
Gareth gaped at him, looking terribly offended.
You see that boy?
He motioned towards Brennick with his head.
He is surely younger than I am, and he has his own blade. I can compose it.
Rune shook his head maddeningly.
I thought you didn't like my blade. You said it was dirty or something.
Gareth sighed in exasperation.
I can clean it.
Rune pretended to be insulted.
Oh, so it is dirty.
That's not what I meant.
He saw the hidden smile.
Oh, you are mocking me. Just hand it over.
He reached for it, gripping it by the hilt. Rune grabbed his wrist and a struggle ensued. Heads turned as they wrestled and laughed over it. Finally, the boy had to give it up. Rune held him tightly, making it impossible to move. He whispered into the boy's ear.
I cannot give it to you yet. That big one is too scary to use.
Gareth stopped his struggling.
Soon then.
He whispered back. Hiding his disappointment, Gareth freed himself and started rummaging through his pack. Brennick and the blond boy from earlier came over to spread their blankets next to him.
This is Run. Yes.
Gareth recognized the boy.
You're the one who found the blade.
Grin smiled shyly, glancing at Gareth through his eyelashes. He seemed absurdly pleased.
I found it hidden in the treasure cave. It was my dream.
Gareth looked at the knife on his hip.
You do not have a blade?
Grin shook his head.
Not yet.
The two boys settled down, one on each side of him. They were tired after the day's march and the excitement of the afternoon. Brennick looked over at him, his eyes filled with starlight and the fading wonder of what the day had brought.
Why do you wear that rag around your throat?
Gareth felt the pressure around his neck for a moment. His fingers touched the cloth tied there.
I was in Lakeside, the city that was destroyed, in the dungeons. They put an evil thing round my neck to stop me from escaping and doing them harm. It was killing me, but my father came to take me out. He and Janos took it off.
Brennick considered this for a moment.
Why were you in the dungeon? They wanted to know what Lord Karth was planning. He wants to help the Viron against Malik. They questioned me. Did you tell them? No. Did they hurt you? A little.
There was a moment of silence.
You were brave then.
Gareth chuckled.
I don't think so. Does it hurt you, still?
Grin asked.
Only when I think of him, the hooded man, and I feel his anger and his hatred, and his great need to destroy all the Viron.
They shared a moment of trembling horror, a memory each one had of the dark malice hunting them. Grin whispered another question.
Why does he hate us so?
Gareth did not answer, even though he had strong suspicions and many clues gleaned from dreams and overheard discussions. He hates the Viron, he thought, but he hates Kale more. In hurting them, he would hurt the Old One. In destroying them, he would deal his mortal enemy a blow from which he could never recover.